ya, peoples! I'm back again with more of the challenge run. I don't have much of an intro this time around since I'm just continuing through the rest of Arc 2 for this video, so... hooray? I'm going to be playing through Blanc's story, Vert's story, and the finale atop the AffimaX Base, so let's not waste any more time and get straight into the action.
私の物語を遊ぶのね。いいわ。一緒に頑張りましょう。
Kicking things off with Blanc's story, we're spawned on a map tile within Lowee, and we're pretty quickly faced with a forced encounter against 3 of these enemies called Delusion Rabbits. Their stats are pretty laughable, which is expected since they're just supposed to be fodder enemies, but they can deal some pretty unexpected damage. Now, the reason for this is actually fairly simple. Blanc has terrible elemental defense, as she's meant to be a physical tank. Combine that with the fact that, for some reason, this specific attack called Sand Attack uses the Darkness element, meaning it automatically becomes an elemental attack, and you get rabbits kicking up dust, dealing hundreds of HP worth of damage to Blanc. Embarrassingly enough, I actually almost died to this encounter because they kept using this attack, so that's fun. Either way, those guys have been defeated, and we're taken to Lowee in a cutscene that I skipped. Here, I have to enter the guild in order to trigger an event so that I can move on to the first dungeon in Blanc's story, the Player 2 Park. Just like the last station Golden Summit from Noir's story, the Player 2 Park introduces a new type of dungeon in V2, which is the Lowee theme park. I personally really like this dungeon type. I'm someone who grew up with Nintendo consoles and games almost exclusively, and Mario has always been one of my favorite long-running franchises, so seeing this dungeon basically be one giant reference to Mario is really touching to me. As for the contents of this dungeon, there's not much for me to mention. I do pick up a blank disc here, the DL-ROM, but unfortunately it only has one idea chip slot available, which is the yellow chip slot, meaning it has little use to me. The next room of this dungeon is where the boss is encountered, and today on the menu is a freshly served Delusion Turtle. Kind of like the Hellish Turtle, this thing is an easy encounter with a low health stat and lower overall stats compared to its counterpart in Noir's story. 2 Tanzadin Trombes are enough to take care of this bipedal reptilian. After we learn about Ram and Ram's location, the next dungeon opens up for us to explore, the Hex Grasslands. Here, I'm able to pick up 2 weapons, the hammer and the white wand. These are weapons for Blanc and a party member we're about to acquire in just a little bit. The hammer is a little bit stronger than Blanc's default weapon, the feather hammer, and has a slightly different combo tree, though the only difference is that it adds 1 rush slot. However, this means I'm still allowed to use the current most optimal combo route available for Blanc. Overall, it's a win-win. So, warping to the platform with the boss event on it, this time we're faced against the Revile Worm. We don't have to fight it alone too. Here, we're joined by Ram and Ram as newly acquired party members. To give you a quick rundown, Ram and Ram are the only elemental specialists in the game. This means that every single one of their attacks uses an element, ranging from fire to darkness. So, you take that, plus Ram and Ram's absurd elemental attack stat, and you're looking at 2 of the most damaging characters in the game. They do have a pretty big drawback though. They're very squishy in terms of physical defense. Meaning, if you're fighting a character who lacks an element to a lot of their attacks, they're most likely going to be taken to critical health or be defeated outright in just a few attacks. So it's best to keep them at a distance, similarly to Uni. Anyways, back to the Revile Worm. This is yet another encounter that's fairly easy. Its stats are just a little bit higher than Dark Purple Infused R4, with expectedly less health due to a lower party member count. But at this point, Dark Purple Infused R4 stats are starting to become the norm, even for basic enemies, which doesn't exactly make the Revile Worm come off as a threat in any sense of the word. All I do is spam Ice Coffins and Tanzadin Trombes, and finish it off with combo attacks. A piece of cake, really. So, with Ram and Ram finally located and rescued, we return to Lowee, skip through a mountain of cutscenes, and head to this newly generated map tile to begin a series of forced encounters. Ram and Ram had actually left our party before initiating this cutscene, meaning that for the first 2 fights, I'm going to be fighting against the enemies with just Blanc. Let's start with the first encounter against Oh, okay. Let me just run away from this random encounter first. Anyways, let's start with the first encounter against... Oh, come on! Another one? Alright, I defeated them this time. Guess it just gives me a bit more XP. Just let me start the first encounter against... Let's start with the first encounter against 4 magical Chocopes. Their stats are certainly underwhelming, but the problem lies with the fact that they have 2 elemental attacks at their disposal, Petite Fire and Wing Flap, which use the fire and wind elements respectively. As I mentioned before, Blanc is supposed to be a physical tank, not an elemental tank, meaning they're still able to do a significant amount of damage to me. Fortunately, I'm able to scrape by with a little bit of luck on my side. The next enemy I have to fight is the Bright Fenrir. This thing has the exact same stats as the Revile Worm we fought not too long ago, aside from lower HP, but with the catch that I have to fight it with Blanc alone, alongside a handicap of lower health because of the previous encounter. Combine that with the fact that I only have a handful of healing items that don't recover much of my health in the first place, and I'm in for a rough time. Regardless, this fight did take quite a bit, and I eventually had to resort to using my combo moves since I ran out of SP, but I eventually got through it, albeit I barely scraped by. If I had to go on to a third encounter with Blanc alone, I would have been done for, right then and there. But thankfully, I'm joined by Sisha in this fight against 4 Z-Bits. Sisha is my win button for this fight, as she's extremely powerful, being 3 levels above Blanc, so I use 4 C-Busters to take care of the Z-Bits and move on to the final encounter of this segment. Ram and Ram join us for this, so it's gonna be yet another piss-easy encounter. Just 3 magic Dogus and heal Dogus that can all be taken down in the blink of an eye. With all of that finished, the string of encounters finally ends, and I can head back to Lowee and heal myself before moving on to the last lap. To tie a neat bow on Blanc's story, we have the Lowee Golden Summit, the final dungeon of this story. Yep, it's exactly as you'd expect. It's the exact same dungeon as the Last Station Golden Summit in Noir's story. Well, in terms of design anyways. Still, having a different layout in the second room doesn't make the reusing of this dungeon sting any less. Albeit, I do like this one a little more because it has a little more blue to it. And I like blue, so this one wins me over more. Regardless of that though, the real point of interest here is the fight against Sisha in the final room. So far, we've had 2 fights against Gold 3rd members, both of which shared pretty similar traits of hitting incredibly hard and being difficult fights without a bit of luck on your side. You'd expect Sisha to be the same, right? Well, in my opinion, Sisha is far and away the easiest fight out of all the Gold 3rd, and it's not even a contest. Now why is that? You'd think her stats being super similar to Bisha and Keisha would indicate this, and yet I still find Sisha to be an incredibly easy fight. For one, you have a physical tank on your team that can easily soak up hits, especially because Sisha is only using physical moves. Not a single one of her attacks has an element tied to it, meaning Blanc can just sit there and eat the damage. And secondly, Ram and Ram dealing elemental damage to such an absurd degree means Sisha can be made quick work of, as she possesses a fairly lackluster elemental defense stat in comparison to Ram and Ram's elemental attack stats. So, unlike the other 2 fights, I'm not worried about getting a game over. I just know that I'll win because it's that easy. But with that said, Sisha is defeated, and just like that, Blanc's story comes to an end. This is the silver medal of the 4 stories in my opinion. I may not be as biased towards Blanc as I am towards Neptune, but this is still a pretty nice story. Now, we move on to the last of the 4 stories, and my least favorite of them all, Vert's story in Leanbox. Let's get started.
さあ、私が主役の物語を始めましょうか。
So, starting off Vert's story, we get... 100 credits? Cool, I guess. Anyways, moving on to the actual gameplay, we start off with a forced encounter against the Gun Ixiom. Is that how you pronounce it? Just like Noir and Blanc's stories, the first bosses we face are nothing special and are just as relevant as regular enemies at this point. Just 2 Sillet Spears are enough to dismantle this heap of scrap so we can move on with our days. Afterwards, I head back to Leanbox and unlock a new dungeon, the Halo Forest. Halfway through my trek, there's an event for me to view, in which we actually get a new party member. Well, she's not necessarily new, but she's still a nice addition, Nepgear. As you might expect, there was cutscene stuff that I skipped which explains why she's here with me in Leanbox, but let's not pay too much mind to that. From here, I traverse through the rest of the dungeon over to the second event marker, where our boss of the hour is waiting for us, the Pandeo Leos. I love how all of these demon-like monsters are given some sort of Final Fantasy-like name, and then the one in Noir's story is just called the Demonic Law. Incredible. Regardless of that, this thing is just as you'd expect. A boss with dark purple infused R4 stats, minus the health because of the lower party member count. And it's also defeated in the way that you'd expect, by spamming my SP attacks until it's 6 feet in the ground. Moving on! With the Pandeo Leos defeated, we return to Leanbox once again, but we're not yet finished with business here in the Halo Forest. Here, we face the same situation that we did in Noir's story. There's no red exclamation point currently available on the map, meaning we gotta head to the guild to collect 2 mandatory quests before we can move on. These quests require me to defeat 8 Rabbi Bloom and 9 Cobra heroes respectively. In terms of the enemies the quests want me to defeat, the Rabbi Blooms are super easy to take care of, and are pretty much a non-factor altogether. And even though the Cobra heroes possess some notable statistics, they're nothing too concerning either. All I need to do for these quests is Slit Spear and Slash Wave every enemy in my line of sight until they're both completed. Once I reach the necessary body count, I return to Leanbox and promptly report each quest so I can gain access to the next dungeon on our radar, the Game's Vision dungeon. But before that, along the way, we have a forced encounter with another robotic boss, the Berserker Z. Its stats are a little higher than the Pandeo Leos' stats, but more importantly, we finally have a boss that surpasses Dark Purple infused R4 in every stat, including HP! Oh, it's so beautiful, I feel like I'm about to cry tears of joy looking at this fabled stat spread. Where was I again? Oh, right. So the Berserker Z, I honestly don't have much else to say about it, really. It's a fairly straightforward boss, and all I do here is spam my SP attacks, and Nepgear nearly gets killed towards the end. All's well that ends well, I guess. So, with that hunk of junk taken care of, we move on to our next dungeon, the Game's Vision Arcade. As you can pretty clearly see, this dungeon is just a reskin of the Club Zeka dungeon from the Zero Dimension arc. Which I know is to be expected from a Neptunia game, but I can still complain about it, so I will. Regardless of that though, say it with me, because you've heard it a million times by now, there's nothing interesting about this dungeon. Although, I will give it this, I kinda like the interactivity with the map. You know, climbing on top of this arcade debris and then jumping through a hole in the wall. We never see that kind of stuff from Neptunia, so I think it'd be cool to see it come back at least once. Reaching the end of the dungeon, we encounter our next boss in line, the Sarveria. And if you can believe it, this thing is just a Pandeo Leos with slightly lower HP. No, I'm not even joking. This thing is literally just a weaker Pandeo Leos relative to my current level. Absolutely incredible. Regardless of that, we defeated it. And now, we move on to the final dungeon, and easily the hardest part of this entire story, and maybe even the hardest part of the second arc in general, the Leanbox Golden Summit. In line with the series' running joke relating to a certain number, this is the third and final Golden Summit that we have to go through in the game. And this one, ooh boy, this one is jam-packed with bosses and events. Let's go through things one at a time, shall we? But before then, I pick up a very important item that will prove to be useful throughout the entire dungeon, and that's a weapon for Nepgear, the Neo NP Beam Buster Alpha. A mouthful of a name for sure, but its power at this point in the game is extremely valuable. It possesses the highest physical attack stat of any weapon I currently own, and will significantly increase Nepgear's damage output, since she won't have to use her default weapon anymore. Which, yeah, the game doesn't keep track of the items you gave to her when she joins you in Leanbox for some reason. Either way, with that out of the way, we move on to the first of the 3 bosses that we're facing in this dungeon, and it's against Big Neptune of all characters. Her stats are fairly high besides what looks to be a pretty mediocre strength stat, but as we've seen with all of the other playable character bosses so far, looks can be deceiving, and Neptune is no different. She's able to use her combo attacks, just like the 3 gold third members we've already fought so far, meaning her damage is much higher than what the stat makes it out to be. Hell, just one set of combo attacks was able to bring Nepgear down to half health essentially, so she's definitely not fucking around. Even still, the strategy here is pretty straightforward. Just spam my SP attacks until she's done for. It was a bit close, and I was considering healing Nepgear out of fear of getting slapped by an EXE drive, but I just settled on using Sillet's Spear to take her down. With Neptune defeated, we immediately move on to the next boss fight, which is against Dogu Man and Dogu Lady. Since they're working as a duo, the main strategy I had in mind was to try and hit both of them at the same time with Sillet's Spear and Slash Wave, as to not waste my SP dealing with one or the other instead of both. By keeping Nepgear and Vert close together, I'm able to move both of them into the range of my attacks, and deal some pretty big damage to both of them. Dogu Lady goes down first, being the one with lower HP, and also the fact that I missed one of my attacks on Dogu Man. But Dogu Man joins Dogu Lady soon after in defeat, and with that, the second boss fight has been reduced to dust. Those of you familiar with V2 know exactly who's coming up next, and I'm sure you're wondering how my attempts went. For those of you unfamiliar, well, let's just say this boss for me is Keisha 1 but a million times worse. Escha, the gold third of Leanbox, and Square Enix reference incarnate. She possesses the highest stats out of any enemy in Vert's story, with immense offense and defense stats, meaning she's going to be an extremely tough fight. Not only this, but she has the highest stats out of all of the gold third members, so needless to say, this is going to be a slugfest back and forth until either one of us drops dead. My first attempt went south basically as soon as it started. Escha immediately began targeting Nepgear, bringing her down to critical health with just 2 sets of attacks, and then tried finishing her off with an EXE drive. I was guarding with Nepgear on this turn, meaning she got to live, but then she got quickly eviscerated by Escha the following turn. To make matters worse, Vert had already run out of SP, meaning she could only do her combo attacks at this point. And, well, that went just as well as you'd expect. So, that's death number 1 to Escha. My second attempt started out even worse. Escha went straight for the EXE drive against Nepgear, getting a critical hit and leaving her on a shred of health. Even after I revived Nepgear, Escha continued to uninterestingly bully her into the ground, targeting her until she was down a second time. And then she did it a third time, until I just decided to accept my fate and take my second L to Escha. I realized by this point that the best chance I had of being able to win this fight was to just grind until I got both Nepgear and Vert to level 30, which is the magical number that allows me to get both of their EXE drives, as well as get them a bit more stats to improve my defense. And so, I did, killing all of the squeeds, bits, and koitsus in sight until I reached level 30 for both of them. And when I went back to fight Escha with my newly acquired EXE drives, it was a significantly easier fight this time around. With 2 EXE drives at my disposal, higher health, and higher defense stats, I was able to easily live through Escha's attacks, and her health was melted in a matter of seconds, putting behind what was probably the most difficult fight in the entire arc in my opinion. Even harder than Bisha, and even harder than Keisha 1. What do you think is the hardest fight in Arc 2, viewers? Let me know in the comments. Anyways, with Escha defeated, Vert's story comes to a close, and with that, we've fully completed every single story in Arc 2. Now, all that's left is to regroup and storm the floating fortress, the AffimaX Base, and take care of Affimojas. After completing all 4 stories, we regain control of Best Girl Neptune and are tasked with going to the other 3 nations to have all of them join our party to prepare for our final showdown. In this case, I went in the order of Leanbox, Last Station, and then Lowee. Leanbox is the closest nation with the least amount of tiles to get there, meaning random encounters are least likely. Oh god damn it! Nepgear and Vert join our party as we move on to Last Station, grabbing Noir and Uni, and then Lowee, grabbing Blanc, Rom, and Ram. Afterwards, we return to Planeptune and get access to the final dungeon of the second arc, the AffimaX Base. And it's at this point where I make a change in my team composition. I'll explain it when we get there, but just know that my front line consists of Uni, Rom, Ram, and Vert, while my backline consists of Neptune, Noir, Blanc, and Nepgear. Now then, let's go ahead and finish this once and for all. Now, for those of you that watched part 1, you might remember me saying this. The only reason I'm doing so is to craft the power bracelet at the earliest time I possibly can. This will be very helpful, not only because it gets it out of the way for the required use of it in Arc 2, well, this is where that mandatory use for it comes in. There are these wooden boxes blocking our path that we're unable to get around, as there are no other entrances or pathways leading to the next area without the use of the power bracelet. The game never tells you that this is required, which made me going into this dungeon blind on my first playthrough quite awkward. Embarrassing myself aside, we move on to the next area and come across our third to last fight of the arc against Steamax once again. In essence, there isn't anything different about Steamax in this fight compared to his fight in Neptune's story. He still has the same attacks and whatnot, but now he has higher stats to compensate for our party being a little over 3 times larger than before. But they're not so much higher that he becomes a genuine threat, especially not when I have 4 powerful party members at my disposal. So, much like his first fight, he's dealt with fairly easily, allowing us to move on to the next section. Oh, actually, before we move on, I just want to highlight Rom's adorable face when you hit an object you can't break. Look at her, she's just trying her best. Anyways, we arrive at the final area of the AffimaX ship, and with it, we begin our second to last encounter of the arc against General Affimojas, the founder of AffimaX and the mastermind of Arc 2. And this is where my seemingly unusual team composition comes into play. Players of V2 will understand exactly why I did this, but for those of you who don't know or forgot, allow me to explain. Affimojas possesses stats that are only slightly higher than Steamax's before him, which would make him seem like a total joke, and in a sense, he kind of is. So you'd expect me to just go into this fight using whatever characters I want and beating him into the ground, right? Wrong. See, the reason for this is because of something that Affimojas himself tells you in the fight. Yep, you saw that correctly. Affimojas is physically untouchable because of the cape that he wears. It doesn't matter if you're level 30 or level 999, you can't do any physical damage to Affimojas whatsoever. So if that's the case, how are you supposed to defeat him? Well, we might not be able to hurt him with physical attacks, but elemental attacks? That's a completely different story. And just like that, we found our solution to this fight. This is why my team composition consists of the characters that it does. Rom and Ram are very obviously elemental specialists, while Uni and Vert have a few attacks that have an element tied to them, such as Uni's power combo attacks, and Vert's Sillet Spear and Spiral Break. Meaning, all I need to do for this fight is to use these characters and I'll easily be able to win this fight, as Affimojas simply crumbles when you use elemental attacks. Now then, with Affimojas defeated, we're able to move on to the final boss of Arc 2. But before that, I just want to let this cutscene play out first.
Henshin!
Oh, so cool! Alrighty then, with my fanboying out of the way, we now actually move on to the final boss, which is once again a fight against Affimojas. As much as I'd love to say that this is some grand fight where you're really struggling to beat him, it's unfortunately not anything of the sort. In fact, because you're allowed to switch your frontline character to the backline and vice versa in the middle of a fight, this means that you're able to use the exact same characters and easily kick Affimojas' ass with more elemental attacks. It's a bit of a shame, honestly. I really wish that Affimojas' fight could only allow you to use the 4 next forms and nobody else, because that would have been a really awesome moment. But alas, after several ice coffins, shillet spears, and fire bullets, Affimojas is defeated once and for all, and the second arc of V2 has come to an end. With 2 arcs down, all that remains is the Heart Dimension arc. I said it before, but I'll say it again, this challenge has been super enjoyable, and I hope that you've enjoyed watching it as much as I have been playing it. I'd be interested in seeing if any one of you watching this video right now would be willing to try and do this challenge and see how far you get. But other than that, I don't have a whole lot else to say, so thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you all on my next upload where the Heart Dimension awaits us. Peace!